Dregs now on the Montreal Canadiens. We heard from Tanner Pearson just a few minutes ago. That injury to his hand, which broken bone leading to an infection, how serious did it get? How close was he to never playing hockey again?
I mean, close enough, right? I mean, there were mobility issues, there were long-term concerns, whether or not he'd get the full dexterity back in that hand. Keep in mind that Tanner Pearson, going through that process, James, had to have, I believe, 7 surgical procedures, including a very significant bone graft. And there was some concern, obviously, as to whether or not the bone graft would take. And the good news is, pretty clear, it did take. He was able to rehab and get back into game-playing shape. And you can see the smile on his face, right, during the intermission. He's thrilled to be back in the National Hockey League because it wasn't that long ago where he and those around were wondering if that was going to be the case.
We talked about the Leafs trio in goal, and there's a similar situation in Montreal with Montembeault and Jake Allen and Caden Primo, and they can't send Primo down without having to put him on waivers. So how do they handle that trio?
Again, it's similarly tricky for the Montreal Canadiens. Who's the defined starter in Montreal? I guess that's to be determined. But you're right. I mean, what gums it up is the fact that, Caden Primo does have to clear. And no different than Joe Wall of the Toronto Maple Leafs, the belief in Montreal is that Caden Primo is not going to clear waivers. So Kent Hughes, the general manager, will continue to have conversations on that. They moved a goaltender to the Vancouver Canucks as part of that Tanner Pearson trade. The Canadiens at this stage don't have a problem carrying 3 goalies, but history also shows us that is an imperfect scenario for all 3 men, so there will be decisions that have to be made in that.
A bright future, and a big part of that is Slafkovsky, who we talked about a little bit on the panel, and David Reinbacher, the 5th overall pick last year. Where do they both end up playing this season?
Well, Slafkovsky is a notch ahead for obvious reasons, right? So the hope, the expectation is that he can be an impactful NHL player. But to develop the way that they need him to develop, even though, as we talked about in the panel, there's no rush with him, feels like he's got to play in that top 6. And the indications are, based on how hard he worked in the offseason, the way he's showing in the preseason, that he's going to be able to do that. Reinbacher's a little bit unique in that he has the European clause. So he can go back to Europe, which isn't a bad thing for the Montreal Canadiens because he can continue to develop there. And as we also mentioned earlier, maybe that frees up a spot for Logan Mailloux to go over to Laval because he's having a terrific preseason as well. So one thing we know about Kent Hughes and the Montreal Canadiens, they're not going to make moves to block the progress of these young players, but these young players have to be able to play at the NHL pace.